In the U.S., the first major outbreak was in Seattle, in Washington state.
Test results are not back, and we have several questions.
And it continues. Of most concern, nursing homes like this one, north of the city. More than 24 senior citizens have died here. Each victim is memorialized with a blue ribbon. Around Seattle, thousands of people have been infected, and the number rises.
My wife's actually pregnant with our first child now, so it's been something that's on my mind constantly, but with this new COVID-19 outbreak, it's something that's even more on my mind, just making sure that I'm taking as many steps as I can to prevent any sort of illness to her and to my family.
Did you ever think that you'd be facing something like this when you got into the...
Oh, absolutely not. Maybe some other things, and I thought maybe terrorist attacks would be our next biggest hurdle, but it sounds like disease between Ebola, swine flu, this now, seems like that's our next big problem.
First responders like Piper struggle to keep up with coronavirus calls, such as the alarm that they are treating all people as potentially positive.
She was laying face down in the dirt, and she was just kind of walking in and out of traffic, and then was sitting in people's vehicles. So then we detained her and decided the hospital was the best route for her.
At the hospital, doctors can determine whether she's been infected. That's what COVID-19 survivor Elizabeth Schneider is doing in her home in Seattle.
Were you my sick nurse when I had the coronavirus? Yeah, you kept me company.
I have a background in science and biology, so that's why this experience has been very interesting for me. I did a PhD in bioengineering from the University of California, Berkeley. I have a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering. I had been to a house party with a group of friends. It was a typical house party. People brought over dishes to share. We had beer, wine, and cocktails. We were chit-chatting, enjoying each other's company. I woke up in the morning. I was feeling really tired. I was feeling groggy. And then I took my temperature, and it was 103 degrees. And at that point, I started shivering uncontrollably. I got the chills. So after a few more days of commiserating back and forth about our various symptoms, that's when one of my friends who was at this party brought to our attention the Seattle flu study. And she recommended that we sign up for it. And so that's ultimately how I found out that I tested positive for COVID-19. When I got the positive test call, what they told me is they said that if you have tested positive, you should stay home for 7 days after the onset of your symptoms or 72 hours after your fever subsides. So I decided that I could go ahead and live my normal life. I was likely not very contagious anymore. My big takeaway from this experience is that I think there are a lot more people out there among us that are getting sick with this, and they either, don't have very serious symptoms and they just think it's a cold, or they think it's a flu, or they don't have those respiratory symptoms, and they are, unbeknownst to them, potentially, transmitting the virus to other people, and they just aren't getting tested. People living on the street are much more at risk. Their immune systems are weaker than ourselves. Like if you're living out of a van, it's cold, you're more susceptible to catching other things. So yeah, they're definitely more vulnerable.
Like Rudi and Joe, two longtime homeless men south of downtown Seattle. Rudi is in his 70s. He lives in his van. And his friend Joe Zacher, who some call Birdman.
There you go. I know you're hungry. I know you're hungry. Me too.
Joe's an out-of-work construction worker who lives in his car. He mostly keeps to himself and his pigeons, and he watches over his pal Rudi.
I'm okay. Don't put no camera above my face.
For more than a week now, as the coronavirus spreads across Seattle, Joe says Rudi has been feeling ill, but Rudi won't go to the hospital.
Coronavirus thing I was worried about too. He is kind of sick. He's more susceptible to it. He's probably going to get coronavirus worse than anything else.
What about yourself? How do you feel?
I don't know. Not worried about it. I smoke too much. That's about it. See that lady over there?
Yeah.
Okay, now, they live in a house that has no water, hardly any heat. They can't afford anything. Are you dragging that over there? Let me help you, honey bunny. No.
Oh, it's kind of heavy. I don't think.
No, it's not.
Can you put it by the can? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Where's your mom?
She's waiting over there by the bus stop.
Okay.
You don't mind taking it there?
No.
Joe says there's not a person on the street who hasn't heard about the coronavirus, especially with Seattle being one of the cities hardest hit.
All I know is the government better make sure that first responders are protected properly. Otherwise, you lose your first responders, what do you got left?
But protective gear is in short supply here too.
To use on a daily basis to get us through probably another 4 weeks of operations. At that point in time, we, like most of our neighboring agencies, will run out of personal protective equipment.
What does that mean?
Well, that means that it places our crews at increased risk responding to these calls. And there are no supplies available anywhere in the United States unless we start getting the federal government to release stockpiles of protective equipment. Stockpiles are designed for use in pandemics, and one would hope that they would release some of these materials to first responders so we can keep our crew members, our firefighters and paramedics, safe when responding to these incidents. If we don't have PPE, our members will be exposed to COVID-19, which will mean that we'll have to place firefighters and paramedics in the quarantine, which means we then won't have enough firefighters and paramedics to respond to other 911 calls.
I do think that it's going to get worse before it gets better in terms of the number of infections, but I think, so far countries are doing the right thing. They're increasing the number of tests. There's a lot more attention on, the symptoms and signs and self-isolation. The timeline of the universe is vast, and we're just a very small blip in that timeline, and life goes on. And things will recover. More people will get sick, but more people will develop immunity, so more people will unfortunately die.
Are you worried about Rudi?
Yeah. Yeah, if he dies, he's gonna suck. He's been here so long, if Rudi was gone, people all around here would care. I'm not worried about the birds. How are you? Well, they help me relax. That's the favorite part. And then sometimes they'll just come right back. It would be a metaphor for it. They're flying off, everyone's scared, but they always come back and get back to normal.
Back to normal. Getting there requires discipline and patience, as most of the world self-isolates. The coronavirus has changed how paramedics work.
You don your gloves, and next thing we'll do is put on a gown.
Personal protection is the new norm.
Gown's going to be kind of your droplet and splash protection. If you had a high index of suspicion, you could put another set of gloves on, an outer glove. I think the next thing that would be important is to don your N95 mask. This is going to be your respiratory protection for coronavirus for yourself. Donning your eye protection, which would be the goggle. It's going to be a tight seal around your eyes.
First responders in Pierce County have seen cases of COVID-19 infection doubling by the day. 40-year-old veteran paramedic and Assistant Chief Russ McAllen drives home a point that many first responders have already. COVID-19 cases are expected to rise dramatically once desperately needed test kits for the virus begin arriving to test patients in this community.
In Pierce County, which has 800,000 people, the number of cases increased from 7 yesterday to 14 today.
And by the time this airs?
It could be doubled and doubled and doubled and doubled again because you're testing more people. We have over 160 personnel in our department. Every morning at 8 a.m. our crews do shift change. The firefighters and paramedics work 24-hour shifts.
Right now, Chief McAllen briefs his personnel on the latest with COVID-19.
There has been one firefighter confirmed COVID COVID-19 positive up north in the Kirkland area because they kept going in and out of that nursing home without PPE on before this became an issue. So he's in isolation. Quarantine is when you have been exposed but are not symptomatic, you don't have a disease. Isolation technically is when you're showing symptoms of the disease. And for us, the biggest thing is get a mask on the patient, the source patient, ASAP. The best way to reduce our exposure risk is to get a patient, get that surgical mask on the patient, because that reduces the amount of large droplets that are coming out of that potentially infected patient. And for those that have kids, one thing you should probably be aware of that so far, kids appear to be fairly impervious to COVID-19. They get it, but they get the sniffles and they move on. In all the fatalities and all the cases in China, not a single pediatric death. That's different than we know than the flu, right? Where kids actually are pretty susceptible. So kids can get it, but they appear to have very minor symptoms.
Across the state of Washington, first responders are now ordered to conduct an essential interview with citizens before they treat them.
They pause at the front door once it's open and they ask, is there anyone inside who has symptoms of a cough, fever, shortness of breath, diarrhea, things that would indicate there's a possibility of COVID-19 or flu? If anyone has those signs and symptoms, they'll pause, put on their personal protective equipment before they go in.